Section 5. The complementarity of mind and matter. The final, and for our purposes, the most important anti-classical feature of quantum mechanics is its emphasis, in most versions, on the role of consciousness. Quote, "Quantum physics assigns an important role to the observer. One particular suggestion that consciousness has a causative role in the physical world arises in this way, where a measurement of a microsystem is made, which is appropriate to distinguish between results which are possible but not certain. Only one of the possible results will be measured. However, until the measurement is made, all the possible results remain possible. So the question arises, at what stage in a process of measurement can it be said that the measurement is actually made, so that a particular result becomes actual and the other possibilities are eliminated? This question is significant because the theory, as generally understood, indicates that the existence of a range of possibilities prior to measurement is not due to incomplete knowledge of the system, but is an objective property of the system itself. And similarly, after measurement of the actuality of one result and the elimination of the others is also an objective property of the system. So it is meaningful and important to ask, when does this change, which is sometimes called the collapse of the wave function, occur? Another way of putting this question is, what causes the wave function to collapse? Hodgson cites one important answer proposed by the distinguished physicists Eugene Wigner and others, is that the collapse occurs, quote, when the person making the measurement actually becomes conscious of the result. This suggestion faces difficulties, at least if taken literally in this form. However, the considerations underlying it are relevant to a rejection of mechanism, and it is significant that distinguished physicists who are researching directly the very physical matter whose behavior is supposed to explain mind have found it necessary to invoke mind to explain the behavior of that physical matter, end quote. David Rose expresses this mental aspect of quantum theory as follows, quote, "One idea within quantum physics is that observing events in some way influences those events. There is an interaction between the observer and the physical world. From here, it is not far to the idea that human consciousness, through acts of observation, interacts with the physical world at the quantum level." Brackets, the Copenhagen interpretation of Niels Bohr. Hence, consciousness itself must be explained at that level, end quote. Rose also says that, quote, "In sum, the idea of quantum theories is that the origin of consciousness is in some way linked with really fundamental aspects of the physics of the universe. To understand consciousness, we have to look right down to events at the quantum level. As regards quantum indeterminism and freedom of the will, it was noted by Eddington as early as 1927 that the indeterminism provided by quantum physics left room for the operation of freedom of the will. Hodgson states that in more recent writings by physicists and mathematicians such as Richard Schlegel, Henry Morgenau, Henry Stapp, and Roger Penrose, the notion of quantum indeterminacy leaving room for the operation of rational choice is revived and advocated. And in fact, according to Stapp, the most radical change wrought by the switch from classical to quantum mechanics is the injection of certain choices made by human beings directly into the dynamics of physical processes. He says, human actions enter, of course, also in classical physics, but the two cases are fundamentally different. In the classical case, the way a person acts is fully determined in principle by the physically described aspects of reality alone. But in the quantum case, there is an essential gap in the physical causation. This gap is generated by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which opens up at the level of human actions a range of alternative possible behaviors between which the physically described aspects of theory are in principle unable to choose or decide. But this loss in principle of causal definiteness associated with a loss of knowable in principle physically describable information opens the way logically to an input into the dynamics of another kind of possible causes, which are eminently knowable both in principle and in practice, namely our conscious choices about how we will act. These interventions in the dynamics take the form of specifications of new boundary conditions. Heisenberg notes that during the 19th century, some scientists were inclined to think that the psychological phenomena could ultimately be explained on the basis of physics and chemistry of the brain. And he goes on to assert, from the quantum theoretical point of view, there is no reason for such an assumption. And Heisenberg also says, we would never doubt that the brain acts as a physiochemical mechanism if treated as such. But for an understanding of psychic phenomena, we would start from the fact that the human mind enters as an object and subject into the scientific process of psychology, end quote. Mind is an independent phenomena. Stapp certainly shares this assumption. He follows John von Neumann's rigorous mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics, in which he calls the effects of free choices upon the physically described world interventions. Stapp continues, these choices are free in the sense that they are not coerced, fixed, or determined by the physically described aspects of the theory. Yet these choices, which are not fixed or determined by any law of orthodox contemporary physics, and which seem to us to depend partly upon reasons based on felt values, definitely have potent effects upon the physically described aspects of the theory. These effects are specifically described by the theory, end quote. It's curious and ironic to hear an eminent physicist appealing to reasons and felt values in order to explain choices when the neuroscience and philosophic establishment is trying to banish such explanations. D'Espagne insists that, taking a quantum perspective, it is logically unacceptable to try to deduce the origin of consciousness as arising from matter. He says, to define any notion, in particular the notion of consciousness, by referring to the notion itself, is to get caught up in a vicious circle. That is why, once more, the concept of consciousness is necessarily prior to the concept of phenomena, since the latter is defined as we have seen it must be, given the weak objectivity of the physical description of the world in terms of appearances valid for all, that is to say, in terms of facts of consciousness, end quote. However, D'Espagne is also careful to point out that consciousness seems always to be associated with an empirical reality that is material. He then asks how these two facts, which at first glance seem to rule out one another, can be reconciled. He answers this question as follows. My own view is that it can be done by conceiving thought and empirical reality as two complementary poles which give rise to each other within the realm of independent reality, end quote. In other words, D'Espagne seems to be pledging allegiance to a form of dual-aspect monism. Hodgson is prepared to spell out this dual-aspect monist position in much less obscure language. He says, if it is accepted that the best theory of matter requires references to consciousness, whether that of individual human beings or animals in the measured by consciousness approach, or that of a community of human beings in some Neo-Copenhagen approach, then the consensus project of capturing mind and consciousness in terms of matter seems fatally flawed. What is strongly suggested is that mind and matter are interdependent and complementary, rather than that one is secondary to the other, end quote. I am rather inclined to think that this is indeed the case.